Welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. Beneath the surface is a world of gliding monsters, one you can choose not to step into or leave at any time. PseudoPod, episode 762, June 18th, 2021. This week's story, The Thought Monster, by Amelia Reynolds. Hey everyone, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's story originally appeared in Weird Tales in March of 1930. And yes, we are absolutely going to stop for a moment and plant a flag on the fact that, yes, women have been writing horror and genre fiction throughout recorded history, and no, they don't get enough credit for it. And I really liked this story, and it annoyed me in a very fruitful way, which we will discuss later on. So much so that I will definitely be seeking out more stuff by her. Amelia Reynolds Long was an American detective fiction writer, novelist, and a pioneer woman writer for the early science fiction magazines of the 1930s. A resident of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, she was the author of a number of SF stories, and her Weird Tales story, The Thought Monster, was made into the 1958 British film Fiend Without a Face. You have to see this, if you possibly can. We'll have a look around, and if there's a version that's easily accessible online legally for free, we'll drop it in the show notes. If not, we'll see if we can find you a buy link. If I tell you the monster is a brain with a spinal cord. Yeah, we're on the same page. Let's move on. She wrote under the pseudonym Peter Reynolds and also the pseudonym A.R. Long. And your reader for this story is the fantastic Spencer Disparty. Spencer is a musician and professional narrator from Phoenix, Arizona. He loves metal, as do we all, my dude, and all things horror. You can find his music at soundcloud.com, Thagirian Band. So, without further ado, we have a story for you, and it has no face. I'm sorry, we have a story for you, and I promise you it's true.
The Thought Monster by Amelia Reynolds Long. The first of the series of outrages was the ease of Welton Grimm. Grimm was a retired farmer with a little place about 3 miles from town, who apparently had not an enemy in the world. Yet one morning he was discovered dead in a patch of woods near his home, with a look of horror on his face that made the flesh creep on those who found him. There were no marks of violence upon the body, only that expression of horrified revulsion at unspeakable things. 2 doctors, a coroner, and a jury puzzled over it, and at least gave out the statement that he had been the victim of a heart attack, which nobody believed. For a while the case was discussed, as all such things are in small towns. Then, just as it was about to drop into oblivion, the second blow fell. Another man, a stranger this time, was found dead under identical circumstances in the same spot. Before the town could digest this, 2 half-grown boys were added to the list of victims, and the very next night a woman was found dead under similar conditions about a mile distant. The police scoured the countryside for the culprit, for it was now admitted that the deaths were the result of foul play, but to no avail. They could find nothing, there seemed to be nothing to find. But when again the terror struck, this time claiming for its victim the mayor himself, the townspeople decided that something drastic must be done at once, and they sent to New York for a detective. He came a keen-witted, intelligent man named Gibson, with a long list of brilliant exploits behind him. After going over the case with the chief of police, he pointed out a fact that was so obvious it was a wonder we had not seen it ourselves. "Those people have died of fright," he said. "There's someone, probably an escaped lunatic, hiding in the woods, who's so hideous that the very sight of him frightens the beholder to death. Since all the deaths occurred within a mile of each other, you will find him hiding somewhere within that comparatively small area." "But we searched the woods," objected the chief. "We searched them thoroughly. There wasn't the sign of a thing." "Did you ever search at night?" asked Gibson. "Well, no," the chief admitted. "Whatever your terror is," went on the detective, "he's too clever to come out in daylight, but at night he's sure of himself. So that's when we must lie in wait for him." Everyone saw the sense of this plan, but few were willing to try it. At least, however, Gibson collected some half-dozen men, and they stationed themselves, armed to the teeth, throughout the patch of woods, to wait for the thing. They had a series of prearranged whistle signals, by which they could communicate with one another should occasion arise. The night passed quietly, but in the morning it was found that the outrages had taken a new turn. Gibson had completely disappeared. The woods were searched for him, and a pond was drained for his body, but without result. Then, about a week later, he wandered into town, a mouthing, gibbering idiot. The morale of the people began to break under this new horror, and to add to their consternation, the grave of the mayor was opened the night before Gibson's return, and his body dragged half out of the coffin. A great mass meeting for the purpose of taking counsel against the terror was now called. The hall was jammed to capacity, for all came who could come. One of the town councilmen was addressing the assembly. He was in the most earnest part of his address when suddenly he stopped. No one had been conscious of any of the doors opening, yet we all knew that another presence had entered the room. There was an apprehensive shuffling of feet and craning of necks as uneasiness among the crowd grew. The speaker took a sip of water and tried to go on, but without success. And then it was as if a thin veil began to form between us and the electric chandelier overhead. With that, hysteria broke loose. There was a stampede for the exits, in which 3 people were trampled to death. Later, the body of the speaker was found upon the platform. The face was twisted into a mask of overwhelming horror. The people were stunned. They crept into their churches to pray, and as if in answer to their prayers, came Michael Cummings, psychic investigator. Cummings first presented himself before the town council. "I have been reading about your trouble down here," he said, "and I would like to try my hand at solving the mystery." He was welcomed with open arms. He did not consider the possibility of an escaped lunatic in the neighborhood, as Gibson had said. "No madman could be responsible for all of this," he said when someone mentioned the subject. "It takes more than the sight of a poor, deranged mind to kill a strong man. No. I believe that there's a supernatural force at work here. Possibly one of the little understood elementals that are sometimes aroused or liberated by a disturbance of the laws of nature. I shall go out to the woods around dusk this evening and look the ground over." "But, man," gasped the town treasurer, "that's suicide. No man comes out of there alive who enters after nightfall." "There is little danger until after night has actually fallen," smiled Cummings. "Besides, even should I meet the terror, I am armed against it in a way that none of the others were." He went but learned nothing. The next morning a farmer, who lived about a half a mile away, was found dead in his barn. That afternoon Cummings called upon Dr. Bradley, who was the coroner. "I'm going to make a strange request, doctor," he began. "I'm going to ask that you permit me to photograph the eyes of this poor man." The doctor, greatly mystified, gave his consent. "In a case of violent death," Cummings explained as he set up his apparatus, "an image of the last thing seen is usually photographed upon the retina of the eye. I want to see whether a carefully developed enlargement won't show us that image." At Bradley's interested request, he promised to let him know the results of the experiment. 2 or 3 hours later, therefore, he returned to the doctor's office. "I have drawn a blank," he confessed. "The eye shows absolutely nothing." "Your theory didn't work, then?" asked Bradley sympathetically. "No," Cummings answered. "And yet, I don't see how it could have failed in a case of this kind. There's one alternative. Perhaps there was nothing for the dying man to see." "But," objected the doctor, "I thought it was what he saw that killed him." "Fear," said Cummings, "can enter a man's soul through other senses than sight. Anyway, I shall work on that hypothesis for a while, and see where it leads me." Abruptly he changed the subject. "Who lives in that rambling old place half a mile out from town?" he asked. A scientist named Walgate," answered the doctor. "I'll admit," he went on quickly, "that the location of his house and his being something of a recluse make it look as if he might be concerned with the mystery, but we have proof that he isn't. For one thing, he was here in town in the company of the most reputable people the nights that the first 3 outrages took place. Could he have any sort of creature concealed about the place on which he might be experimenting? Asked Cummings. No, answered Bradley. He isn't that kind of scientist. Psychology in its most abstract form is his line. In fact, I was around to see him myself, thinking he might possibly have something like that. I wonder, said Cummings, if you would mind going again. The next day they called upon Dr. Walgate. They found a courteous, scholarly man, plainly as much concerned over the mysterious deaths as they were. Doctor, asked Cummings presently, have you ever considered the possibility of the terrors being nothing physical at all, but a kind of psychical entity? The doctor shot him a keen, swift glance. Yes, he said, I have considered that. And you have come to the conclusion... It is difficult to come to a conclusion in matters like this unless one has some definite point to start from. To Bradley's surprise, Cummings did not follow up this very evident lead, but soon brought the visit to a close. Why didn't you press the psychical entity opening? He asked a little reproachfully as they walked back to town. It was plain that Walgate either suspects or knows something in that direction. Suspects may even know, but cannot prove, corrected Cummings. But he is the type of man who will not speak until he can prove. Meanwhile, to attempt to force his confidence would defeat our own purpose. At Cummings's suggestion, the people in the outlying districts kept violet-shaded lights burning outside their houses after nightfall. The thing which we are fighting, he said, is supernatural, and our best weapon against it is the violet ray, which is highly inimical, and sometimes even fatal to it. Look here, said Bradley. Aren't you introducing a little too much legerdemain into this? I can accept a primitive natural force running amok, but when you begin to fight it with colored lights, I grow skeptical. Is this an attempt to give the people a mental sedative? Cummings only smiled, and the people went on burning their lights. The outrages ceased. It looks as if you had raised the ghost after all, admitted Bradley, when a month had passed unmarred by any fresh tragedy. But Cummings shook his head. No, he said. I have only staved him off temporarily. As soon as we should cease to use the lights, he would return. More, he may even grow strong enough to resist them. I think that in a day or two I shall visit Walgate. Perhaps I can induce him to talk. But that time never came. That night, a car drove into town with a dead man in the driver's seat, his hands gripped to the wheel in convulsions. In the tonneau sat 2 more corpses whose faces, like that of the driver, were contorted with stark terror. Only the ruler-like straightness of the road and the vice-like grip of those dead hands upon the wheel had kept the car from overturning. It was like a challenge from the terror to the town, and for the first time Cummings was discouraged. We can protect ourselves, he said, but we cannot protect those who come here from the outside. Something must be done at once, and yet there's nothing that can be done. The situation is even more appalling than the tragedies themselves. And then, in the gray of early morning, something was done. Cummings and Bradley were sitting in the doctor's office when the telephone rang. Bradley answered it. Yes, is that Dr. Bradley? The voice at the other end was hoarse and strained. This is Dr. Walgate. I want you and Mr. Cummings to come up to my house in half an hour. Walk straight in without ringing, and go into the living room. There you'll find a manuscript lying on the table. I want you to read it, but do not come until half an hour from now. But why? What? Stuttered Bradley in his excitement. Do as I tell you, interrupted Walgate's voice. That is all. A metallic click told that he had hung up. What do you make of it? Asked Bradley when he had repeated the message to Cummings. Is it a trap? No, it is not, answered Cummings promptly. It is not a trap. Walgate is no fool, and he accordingly will not take us for any either. We had better do as he tells us. Including waiting the specified half an hour before going out? Yes, we don't know what he intends to do. An attempt to improve upon his directions might ruin his plans. Watches in hand, they sat counting off the minutes. At last, Cummings rose. "We can start now," he said. "Come." They drove out to Walgate's house and entered as he had directed. Bradley noticed that in the nearby woods no birds sang, and that in the house itself an unearthly stillness brooded. He experienced an unnerving intuition of new horrors about to be laid bare. They proceeded into the living room, and Cummings pressed the electric light button, for the daylight was still dim and uncertain. Placed conspicuously on the table was a small bundle of manuscript. "We may as well read these now," said Bradley. "There's no use stopping to look for Walgate. He undoubtedly used that half an hour to make his getaway." Cummings picked up the manuscript and began to glance through it. "It seems to be part of a diary," he said. "It is made up of entries beginning about a year ago. It looks—" He broke off to read several sentences under his breath. "I think I had better read this aloud from the beginning," he said. He began to read. August 4th. Have been studying the material existence of thought, a fascinating subject. If thoughts have material existence, why could not the thought essence be concentrated to— Off on that wild theory again. I'm too old for this nonsense. August 7th. I wonder if many of the so-called psychic phenomena, such as table tipping and the like, are not in some way connected with the materiality of thought. I am tempted to try a few simple experiments. August 11th. I have been wasting my time on these silly experiments. I must return to my respectable psychological studies. August 13th. Success! Today I moved a small object by the power of thought alone. Since this can be done, what will not be possible once the power is properly developed? August 25th. I have complete mental control, and now my old theory returns. Shall I consider it seriously? It seems too silly even to write down here, and yet... August 27th. I shall do it. I shall create a mental being by the concentrated power of pure thought. I am making arrangements with an architect to build in my house a room lined with lead, since lead is least conductive to thought waves, and so will not permit the precious thought essence to escape. September 16th. The room is finished. I have been spending 5 hours a day in it, concentrating upon my thought creature. October 18th. Today I thought I detected a kind of gathering tension in the atmosphere, but probably it was my imagination. It is too early to look for results. November 24th. The strain of my experiment is beginning to take my strength. December 12th. I fainted today in the lead room. December 29th. Have been forced to give up my experiment temporarily because of my health. Have locked the lead room in order that the thought essence may be preserved until I can return to complete my work. January 5th. Am recovering rapidly. January 18th. All my work has gone for nothing, and through the carelessness of a servant, Mrs. Jensen, in a fervor of house cleaning, unlocked and left open the door of the lead room. If I am to go on with my experiment, I must begin at the very beginning, for all the precious thought essence has escaped. And just when success was so near. I have discharged Mrs. Jensen. I shall keep no more servants. May 1st. We have had a sad accident here. Welton Grimm, a neighbor of mine, was found dead this morning on the road, which runs by the patch of woods between his farm and my house. A pity. Grimm was barely past the prime of life. Dr. Bradley says it was heart failure. May 15th. A strange coincidence. A stranger who was stopping in town was found dead in almost the same place that they found poor Grimm. Oddly enough, the cause of death was the same too. Some of our more superstitious citizens are alarmed. May 17th. Something is wrong here. 2 boys who were fired up by the talk of their elders had gone exploring after dark in the region where the deaths occurred were found dead early this morning. Someone is responsible for these tragedies. Coincidence does not go so far. May 18th. Another. A woman this time. On the face of each of the victims is a look of the purest terror. What can it mean? May 20th. Had a most peculiar experience today. I was sitting in my study at dusk. Suddenly I felt that I was not alone, that there was another intelligence in the room with me. I looked up. There was no one there. I switched on the lights, and the illusion vanished. Am I becoming the victim of nerves? May 25th. Another victim. This time our poor mayor. What is this terror that is stalking among us? The people have sent to New York for a detective. June 1st. I am being haunted. 3 times this week I felt distinctly that someone was following me, but when I turned to look, there's no one there. Dr. Bradley called, discussed series of tragedies. June 2nd. I am not alone in the house. Something is living here with me. I enter a room and know that it has just been occupied by another. I go down a dark hall and feel something lurking in the shadows. Yet I search and find nothing. Only brilliant lights can hold the thing at bay. June 3rd. Gibson, the New York detective, has disappeared. Is he, too, a victim of the terror? June 4th. A thought has come to me. Is there any connection between the terror and the thing that occupies my house with me? June 5th. I have solved the mystery of the terror, and the solution is more awful than was the mystery itself. I had gone into the lead room for some books that were stored there. Presently I became aware that something was in the room with me. This time I did not look up, but stood perfectly still, waiting and listening. And then the air was filled with something that had being, yet was not made of matter. Great waving tentacles were groping for my mind, trying to suck it into themselves. With a scream I rushed from the room. The experiment which I had began last fall had succeeded without my knowing it, and I have let a thought monster loose upon the community. June 7th. Even a thought monster cannot live without food. On what does this demon subsist? Can it be that... June 9th. Last night I committed an atrocious crime against society, but it had to be done. I entered the cemetery and opened the grave of the mayor. One glance at his blackening face showed me that he had died an imbecile. My suspicions were right. The thought monster is a mental vampire, feeding upon the minds of its victims. June 10th. Gibson has returned, but his mind is gone. The intelligence that once was James Gibson has been swallowed up in the maw of my detestable invention. I am responsible for his state, and for the deaths of those other poor wretches. But what can I do? If I tell the people the nature of this force that is terrorizing the community, they will not believe me. What ordinary man could accept a creature created entirely of thought? June 12th. The thing is growing bolder. Last night it entered the town hall where nearly 1,000 people were assembled and caused a panic. 3 people were killed, not including one of our councilmen who fell a victim to the thing. I am 4 more times a murderer. Cannot heaven show me a way to put an end to this? June 14th. Michael Cummings, a psychical investigator, is here to run down the terror. Will he succeed? I doubt it. June 16th. Another man has died. June 18th. Cummings and Dr. Bradley were here today. Do they suspect me of being concerned with this series of deaths? They are right, and yet how far from the truth. No human mind could ever conceive the awfulness of that. I was tempted to tell Cummings my whole story, but held back. What proof could I offer him? How could I convince him that I was not mad? Even the relief of confession is denied me, for I would not be believed. June 30th. Cummings is checkmating the terror by means of the violet ray. His work is only temporary, though. But it has given me an idea. The violet ray, sufficiently intensified, can destroy a psychic force. I shall have the lead room fitted with violet lights, then lure the thing there and destroy it for good. July 3rd. Had begun working wiring the lead room. I must do the work myself since I dare not bring an electrician here for fear of the terror. So far it has not tried to attack me. July 10th. I have completed my task, but the thing suspects something and will not go near the room. I can feel its tentacles groping for my mind, trying to read my thoughts. I think it would attack me if it dared, but for some reason it fears me, perhaps because I am its creator. July 22nd. The thing is becoming desperate through lack of food. I can feel that it is planning some bold move. Is it marking me for its next victim? July 24th. This is the last entry I shall ever make in this diary, and it is addressed to you, Dr. Bradley and Mr. Cummings. Tonight I was in town when the death car arrived. I knew then that the thought monster must be destroyed at once. Nature always meets a vital emergency, and so she met this one. As I looked upon those 4 poor beings whose minds had gone to feed the thing I had created, and whose lives had flickered out in the horror of what was happening to them, I saw clearly the one way to stop the havoc for which I was responsible. When I telephoned you, I bade you wait half an hour before coming here in order that I might arrive ahead of you, and put the first part of my plan into execution. For I feared that should I take you into my confidence beforehand, one of you, through distorted humanitarian motives, might attempt to stop my going through with my design. This, then, is my plan. I shall go into the lead room with all mental guards down. The thing has been particularly inimical to me lately, and finding me in that state will follow me in. Then I will close the door on both of us. I do not think that the thing will suspect. A hungry beast is seldom wary of traps. When the door is safely closed, I will turn on the violet lamps. By the time you arrive and reach the end of these papers, those lamps will have done the work for which they were designed. You will find the lead room at the end of the hall on the first floor. Open the door carefully, it is not locked. And if you receive the faintest intimation of an intelligence beyond, slam it shut again, and wait for the lights to complete their task. Mr. Cummings had better attend to this. If you receive no such intimation, you will know that the monster is dead, and that the curse so unintentionally laid upon you all is lifted forever. In your charity, do what to you seems best with the other thing you will find there, the thing that will have been Julian Walgate. As Cummings read the last sentence, Bradley made a dash for the door. "Not so fast," Cummings called after him. "Where are you going?" "Going?" Bradley paused momentarily in the hall. "To that lead room, of course. The man is killing himself. Don't you see it?" Deliberately, Cummings placed the diary on the table. "If any harm was to come to Walgate," he said, "the damage is already done. If not, a few minutes more and there can do him no harm, while our too hurried and careless entry may undo the work for which he was ready to pay the highest price in man's power." He passed the doctor and led the way down the hall, stopping before the last door. Slowly he turned the knob and pushed the door open a few inches. A bar of vivid purple light fell across his face. "Is it all right?" Bradley whispered close behind him. "I think so." Cummings opened the door a bit further. In the room beyond was an atmosphere of snapped tension of climax that had passed. They stepped across the threshold, and then they became aware that the room still held a living occupant. From the far corner, his clothing wrinkled and torn, his hair and trim Van Dyke beard in disarray, there shambled toward them a helpless, mindless idiot.
You can't go wrong with a title like that, can you? Well, we can't. We have the advantage of being credulous witnesses, as opposed to the hapless detectives on the case, or the people involved with the victims. For us, this is a romp, this is a laugh, a ripping yarn, like they used to say. For them, it's the horror of thought itself given form. Except there's more to it than that, because there's always more to it. Unlike every form of art, it's as much about what you bring to the table as what's already on there. This is the sort of horror I grew up with, or I perceive this as the sort of horror I grew up with. The English countryside littered with quiet, beautiful villages crammed full of terrible secrets, and the broken and altered. The first time I went to the theatre was to see The Woman in Black, and that's 34 years ago, and I can still tell you every primary beat and the exact points at which I screamed, which was most of the second act. Also the best dog in theatre ever in that show. The possible exception of Montmorency from Three Men and a Dog, but he was two-dimensional. Anyway, moving on. Not long after that, I read Knights of Pendragon, Way Too Young, which is a fantastic Marvel UK horror comic. And then that was followed by Lords of Misrule, which is another very good UK horror comic. And then a light smattering of Hellblazer, which wasn't quite John Constantine slipping me issues in a newsagent's going, read this, mate, but not quite not that. And now here we are. And stories like this look like one part Homecoming and one part A Stark Warning. None of us listen to, and by none of us at the moment I mean perhaps people more on my side of the Atlantic than yours, because what really jumps out at me here is the twofold way that the story explores the damage caused by scientific inquiry and by the class system. First, don't worry, I love science, it's great. I'm not going to advocate against science or suggest fit young people don't need vaccines. If that's what you're expecting, you have the wrong balding podcaster. But the class thing, that messes me up. Especially since, like I say, 2016 or thereabouts. Fake laugh, real pain, imminent different coloured passport. Because when you grow up in this country, you grow up under the shadow of centuries of tradition, and almost all of that tradition involves people who have more money and land than you ever will at deciding what's best for you, and by you they always, without exception, mean them. Look at the way the maid is blamed here, while Walgate is completely unable to acknowledge his own ridiculous guilt in meddling with mysterious powers because he rather fancied it. This is the living definition of the confidence of a mediocre white man, coupled with a time period where what happens if we go over here and or possibly set this on fire whilst claiming it as our own was pretty much the default. There's no malice here, that's the weird thing, because somehow that just makes it worse. Just the assumption that Walgate is the main character in his own story. He's not. He recognizes that far, far too late. The fact he does is what does actually, in the end, make him heroic. Not his actions, and certainly not his class. Or in this case, near total lack thereof. Great story. Thanks, everyone. We're now paying associate editors who are slush readers in the first line of contact for every magazine and every author. They are the unsung heroes of the industry. We're singing them. We can't pay them at the level we want because we haven't quite reached that with donations yet. So if you possibly can, please help out, because if you do, you will literally make this industry a more inclusive and open and better place, because everyone deserves to be paid for their time and everyone deserves to be paid fairly, and that's what we're trying to do. There are two ways you can help. The first is with money. That's probably the easiest one. You can either subscribe for as little as $5 a month through Patreon or PayPal, both of which will give you access, to an audio vault full of treasures and delights. There are higher levels available through the Patreon that get you other stuff too. Or you can donate via Twitch, which is, again, $5 a month, and is a little bit fiddly, but we do have a walkthrough for you, which you can find at escapeartists.net/Twitch. That's if you have an Amazon Prime account, by the way. Also, if you can't donate money, and we know things are tough, the truth is the pandemic is very far from over, and everyone is still struggling, so believe me, we appreciate every cent we get, and we understand completely on every cent we do not. If you can't give us money, perhaps you could give us some time. Nothing much. Just leave a review on your favourite podcatcher, or link to an episode you particularly liked, or write a blog post, or do something like that. Do you have a podcast? ask us to be on it if you want. We love doing cross-promotion like that. Anything like that helps like you would not believe. So if you have the money, we really need your help. And if you have some time, but not necessarily the money, we really need your help too. Thank you. We'll be back next week when, as now, we will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license, and will feature Charged by Liana Renee Heber, read by Joe Williams. I leave you with this quote from Knights of Pendragon, the classic Marvel series about to be republished in an omnibus at the end of the year, or perhaps the start of next year, I forget, which, believe me, I will be pulling from a lot once that finally happens. Something had reached for me from this dark and terrible place. Something ancient and forgotten. Something in great pain. See you next week, folks.
It's a PseudoPod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.